So are you curious about the different types of sponge cakes? This video is for you. So in this video, I'll be covering 4 main types of sponge cakes. Now I do like to know that there are various types of sponge cakes in the baking world, but today I'll be focusing on the 4 main types used by bakers. So the first type of sponge cake is the biscuit. It's actually written like biscuit, but it's pronounced biscuit. So this tends to be a cake that's very simple. It uses egg whites, actually uses full eggs, but you whip the egg whites, make a meringue by adding some sugar, and then you fold in your egg yolks, and then you add the flour. Now this is a very versatile sponge cake that can actually be used to assemble different types of cakes like black forest or white forest, but please know it does tend to be a bit dry because there's no any type of fat. So most of the time you do have to moisten the sponge to actually get a good result, but it's a very popular type of sponge cake. The second type of sponge cake is the genoise. Now this is similar to the biscuit that actually uses sugar, eggs, flour, and actually the eggs are the raising agent. The difference with the genoise is that most of the time you're going to whisk the whole eggs together, most of the time under a double boiler, so that helps the eggs actually expand and become bigger. This gives you a very fluffy kind of foamy batter. Now some versions of the genoise actually add in melted butter or kind of melted fat. The third type of sponge cake is an angel food cake. Now this is a very, very white food cake. That's why it's called angel food cake. All it uses is egg whites, sugar, some flavoring, and flour. Now this tends to be very sweet, but it is also very dry. So it's used to assemble in different ways. Most of the time you do have to moisten with some syrup and then maybe fill it with some fruit filling and then cover it with whipped cream. But it's a really popular type of sponge cake. The fourth type of sponge cake is one of my favorites, and that's a chiffon cake. Now some call this a sponge cake that cheats because it actually uses a chemical raising agent, and that's baking powder. However, you do use the whisking method. Egg whites are used, and then you whisk, add some sugar, so that gives you volume. However, you also add on baking powder that adds volume in that cake. Now the cake also uses vegetable oil, so it tends to be a very moist cake, and you don't need to moisten it for any reason. Now I just wanted to mention one more type of sponge cake that's really a type of biscuit. It's called the joconde. A lot of pastry chefs use it for assembly of like different types of cold desserts or entremets. So generally it's used by pastry chefs, not really bakers, but it tends to be a sponge that's generally baked like a rectangle and very thin. Now the difference between a biscuit and a joconde is that you add some almond flour or almond meal into that, and then when you're finished with it, you do tend to add sugar syrup or just sugar to keep it moist. Now like I said, it's used for a lot of assembly of entremets and other types of pastries. Now to recap, various types of sponge cakes. That's a biscuit, chiffon cake, genoise, angel food cake, and I also mentioned the joconde cake. Hi, are you a baker wondering when you should use sugar syrup on your cake? In this video, I'll be covering the various types of cakes that need sugar syrup and when to use it and when not to use it. I want to discuss syrups and when to use them on cake and whether you should use them. So number one, just defining what that is. A syrup is basically a mixture of water and sugar, and sometimes flavoring is added, like maybe you can use berries, you can use strawberries, raspberries to make this kind of syrup that's very, very flavored. However, you can actually just do sugar syrup where you boil some sugar and some water until it completely dissolves, and then you cool it and you have a syrup. Now the reason why people use syrup is most of the time to moisten their cake. So this is when you cut your cake in half, we call that torting, and then what you do is you actually dab on some syrup, maybe on both sides of your cake. You can use a spoon with this or you can use a pastry brush. Now the thing is, these days bakers are wetting all their cakes, and usually you want to do this only with dry cakes. You don't specifically have to do them with all types of cakes. For example, our butter cake recipes for Amari tend to be very, very moist. So if you choose to wet them with some syrup, you end up with a very soggy cake. So I'd tell you, one of the times you want to look at when should I add sugar syrup to my cake is your cake generally a dry cake? If it is, then add it. But if not, it is not always necessary. The other reason that you can use sugar syrup sometimes, especially when it comes to custom cakes or wedding cakes that are staying long, is to actually add on the shelf life of cake. So yes, sugar is actually sometimes used as a preservative, and if you know your cake is gonna stay for long, you might want to dab on some sugar syrup on there. However, again, if your cake recipe is very moist, you may not be able to do that because it's gonna end up being sort of like this soggy mess. So you do want to look at when you do that. So when we're using our recipes, generally we tell our students, or we tell bakers, to generally use syrup on a sponge cake. There's sponge cakes that tend to be quite dry, and those tend to absorb syrup so much better, and you get a better result. So that's when I want to tell you to use syrup. Don't use it when you have a moist butter cake. Use it when you're using like a sponge cake or something that's dry, that's gonna need that moistening in there. So I want to give you guys an example so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I'm going to show you guys two types of cake: a chocolate sponge cake. This is made with a biscuit method. And then I'm going to show you a chocolate butter cake. This has like fat and a sugar, and then you're going to see the differences between the two of them. And then later on, I'm going to show you how you can wet your sponge cake if you're looking to do that, okay? So in this case, I'm going to cut my chocolate butter cake. I'm just gonna cut it in half so you guys see how it looks like. So that's very moist, as you can see, guys. It's a very moist cake, and there is no need to actually wet it. So I'm cutting the chocolate sponge cake with a biscuit in it, and this is also looking a little bit moist. But if I was to touch this, you can tell that there's a difference in texture for both of them. My final note on butter cakes is that some people do tend to make drier butter cakes, especially if you're somebody who makes custom cakes and you need them dry because you want them to hold that shape. If this is the type of butter cakes you do, then yes, at that point you do want to wet that cake with some syrup. So there are instances where butter cakes do tend to be dry, you want them compact, and you can use sugar syrup on them. But generally you want to make sure you're doing this on the sponge cakes and not on the butter cakes. And most of your butter cakes, especially for the single or like 3 or 4 layered cakes, you do want those quite moist where they don't need a syrup. However, you can use a filling in between them, like a berry filling or something like that, or your frosting, so that it, you know, adds on to that moisture. But generally your butter cake should be nice and moist.